Yeah, then the last thing, which I think is also really, really relevant, is that on March 16th, 1968, the My Lai massacre occurred. And then exactly a year later, the a veteran and a journalist, Ron Ridenhour, who word about the My Lai massacre had been going around, and the army had heard about it. They had done investigations, including one with Colin Powell, which were just whitewashed, right? And then Ron Ridenhour wrote about it to congressmen and media, and the famous journalist Seymour Hersh, who's a friend of Green and Red, wrote about it and broke it open. And I think because right now, so much of the Israeli propaganda is being based on these stories of what Hamas did on October 7th. And there's a couple of things going on there. One, we don't see any evidence of it yet. The media played up this thing like UN finds evidence of Hamas sex crimes. But the reality is there isn't any confirmation. Now, I think it's important to understand, and My Lai showed it, these kinds of things happen. And the media is trying to put this slant on it. These are Arabs doing it, or these are Muslims doing it, but this is really common in war. And My Lai was really one of the most notable, the best known example of that during the Vietnam War. And really, the only person who actually got in any kind of trouble was Lieutenant William Cali, who's the head of Charlie Company. He was initially sentenced to 20 years for murder. Nixon commuted it to house arrest. There was an investigation done by General William Piers, the Piers Commission. Piers actually did a quite good job and recommended 34 different court martials for U.S. soldiers at My Lai, which did not take place. Ernest Medina, who was the
Captain
uh,
of
the captain of second in command, I believe, to Cali, was found not guilty. And essentially, these people were using that Nazi defense, right? I was just following orders. Many years ago, I met a lawyer who was actually part of the prosecuting team for Cali, and he caught hell. He was ostracized. People really were pissed off at him because they thought Cali, and ironically, even VVAW, the anti-war veterans, they didn't defend Cali, but they essentially pointed out Cali was being scapegoated, that this kind of stuff went on. And I think right now, because so much of the propaganda, and I'm not suggesting Hamas says, I don't know what happened, but we do know that so many of these allegations from the start, babies beheaded and all kinds of stuff like that, just have no verification. There's no evidence for them. They've never been proven after all this time. Remember, with day 2 or 3, a hospital got blown up, and the U.S. immediately said that was Hamas. Israel did. Oh, they've now blown up what 35 more hospitals, right? So
right.
just when we talk about wars and things like that, this is the nature of them. But it's also important to understand that the United States fights wars as brutally as any country ever has. They dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. In Vietnam, they had free fire zones. Kinds of things like happen in My Lai were not rare. They weren't uncommon. They didn't happen every day, but they weren't uncommon either.
They dropped more bombs on Vietnam than they did on Germany and Japan combined.
Combined. Yeah.
The non-atomic bomb.
And Vietnam is roughly the size and area of New Mexico. So
Right.
imagine 4.6 million tons of bombs dropped on New Mexico. But I think the way that the U.S. handled My Lai, Cali became a national hero in a lot of ways. In the South, radio stations would talk about him, the hero. And I forget, somebody wrote a song about him, the Ballad of William Cali, and all kinds of stuff like that. Most public opinion polls showed sympathy for him. And like I said, even VAW, it was a scapegoat. This is the way the war was being fought. And it was clearly understood. You go out there and you just kill everything that moves. And that's just like, considering the way the propaganda, especially right now, is taking root, I think that's important.
I think and you can tell the story much better than I can, but I think it's also important to point out the heroic actions of people on that day, which included Hugh Thompson, who I believe was a warrant officer,
Yeah.
who actually stopped some of the killing by Charlie Company.
Yeah. Yeah. Hugh Thompson was in a helicopter and he saw these Vietnamese being lined up and just slaughtered. And so he made the copter go down. He actually positioned himself in between Cali's troops and the Vietnamese. And when then there's an exchange there where Cali's pissed off about it, and Thompson says, "What are you doing here?" And Cali tries to pull rank, and Thompson says, "I'm going to report this. We'll see what happens." And he did, but like I said, the initial investigations were kind of whitewashed. But Hugh Thompson, in a really vile and lurid war, Hugh Thompson emerges as a really notable and noble individual. You don't see that very often, actually. in all of U.S. War history, the kind of things that Hugh Thompson did don't appear that often. Yeah, amid that really horror, that darkness, um, he was a really heroic figure, and that's important to know too. But just right now, I've had people who I generally think have pretty good politics who are saying, "What about Hamas?" Or even people in Gaza don't like Hamas, or Hamas did this, and it's a war. And what they did on October 7th was included a massacre, atrocities. I don't know what word you want to use for them, but obviously what Israel's done and what we know about. It's just important to understand the nature of war, what happens, and why this is all really fodder for propaganda. And it's really difficult to say this is only Hamas doing this is what Hamas, this is what the Palestinians are doing, whatever, because no one has a record of terror and attacking civilians and conducting these human rights atrocities more than Israel does.
And if you want to see them, Israeli soldiers are more than happy to be posting them on TikTok.
And that's the thing.
I'm not joking. I'm not being cute here either. I am
No,
cute,
I know,
but I'm not
and
trying to
I'm
be cute.
glad you said that because that's an important point. Because with My Lai, there we have images and we have the firsthand. We know exactly what happened that day, right? The facts really aren't in question. In addition to the murders, and I think there were 128 murdered, there were about 24 or more rapes and sexual assaults to get to this point about sexual assaults in wartime, right? That was clearly happening. We know what happened there. And right now in Gaza, with these IDF troops, we know what's happening because they're bragging about it. They're
Yeah.
putting images up, they're putting them on Instagram, they're putting them on Twitter and everywhere else.
TikTok.
And that's the thing. If you want to attack somebody, you better. And so, like the whole they beheaded 40 babies thing. At this point, I think we can pretty safely say that never happened, because within 6 months, if something that horrific and heinous had happened, there would be some evidence of it. Because
the Israelis and the U.S. would have been more than happy to share that evidence if it actually happened at this point.
Exactly. And they said, I've seen it. That would be everywhere, right? That stuff would have been released everywhere. It's just something to keep in mind. There is a historical legacy here. This is the way wars are fought.
I want to point out one other thing about My Lai
Yeah.
is that after the complaints were made about the massacre, that within the army bureaucracy, it was actually there was a pretty big attempt at a cover up. And one of the culprits of that was a major who later became a general and chair of the Joint Chiefs and Secretary of State, which was Colin Powell. Yeah. Colin Powell is actually often touted as a hero in many circles, not in our circle, but I just want to point out the importance is that Colin Powell, who actually sold in early 2003 that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, is also the same person who attempted to cover up the My Lai massacre. And so he was not railroaded into doing anything in 2003. He had a history of it. And I think that's an important thing to point out, because he's seen as a hero by many, won the Gulf War for whatever.
Yeah. No, it's really this really lurid and frightening thing. And what's important to understand too is, because it's often presented as an outlier, an aberration, and it's not the case. Nick Turris wrote a book called Kill Anything That Moves, which is, if you study Vietnam, everything in there you're aware of already because you would have seen the reports. There was a group called Tiger Battalion, which went around, and their only role was really to destroy and murder kind of civilians. And keep in mind, in the Vietnam War, about 3 million Vietnamese died. And the big majority of them were not soldiers. There weren't that many soldiers in Vietnam, actually, right? So it was a war that killed a lot of civilians. And this is just the nature of war, of American wars. It's what Israel is doing today. There are great similarities between what Israel is doing in Gaza today and what the U.S. did in Vietnam. And I think that's important to reckon with. And I think, go ahead.
The other operation from Vietnam, which actually reminds me a lot of what's going on in Gaza, is the Phoenix Project, where the U.S. military was trying to destroy the Viet Cong infrastructure in the South, and basically waged a war against the civilians of assassination and torture and all of that, which is exactly what the Israelis are doing, saying that they're trying to dismantle Hamas.
Yeah. I mean, I've spoken to a significant number, a lot of Vietnam vets. And I mean, I really do think 100% of them, all of them, had some anecdote about seeing a Vietnamese civilian tortured or killed. But the point of the war too is, like, one of the measures of success was the body count, right? We killed this many. For instance, in My Lai, the government announced that it killed 128 Viet Cong. There were very few men left in the village. They were all gone. So when they got to the village, it was almost all just women and kids. And yet they reported 128 VC dead, and the media ate it up, and it was in Stars and Stripes, and it was just reported as a successful battle. It was like and that was the way the U.S. did it. We killed more of them, and we get the numbers going. But at the end of the day, that didn't obviously mean a whole lot. And keep in mind too, the difference between Vietnam and Gaza. Vietnam's a big country. There are places you can go, and you actually have support from the Viet Cong or the PAVN or whoever. In Gaza, there's no such thing. These are people who are now in what Rafah, basically, you've virtually almost 2 million people in southern Gaza and Rafah who have nowhere to go and don't have any support. Egypt is not supporting them, right? So it's a really horrific situation. But I know people are stunned by this, as they should be. It's horrific. But this is how these kinds of wars are fought, and it really is, if you follow this closely, sadly and strikingly similar to what the United States did in Vietnam, which is one of the biggest war crimes in military history, and when Israel is clearly matching that right now.
Right.
So to Alice Hers and Rachel Corrie and Ron Ridenhour and Hugh Thompson, present a salute. And
Thanks for you did.
The other day, we talked to Graham Klumpner, who was active in the anti-imperial movement in the military. Last year, we talked to Henry Hendrickson from Fortress on a Hill, which is a group of anti-war vets. There's a group called About Face, Vets for Peace, VVAW. So there are a lot of soldiers out there who are really doing great stuff and who are trying to keep this kind of legacy alive of these peacemakers, right? People like Hugh Thompson and Ron Ridenhour and others. But it's an important legacy to understand.